I know there are a few people here who weren't here last week who have seen the video of the sermon. The tail end of it got cut off a little bit, so I'll fill you in if you don't remember. That last quote in the sermon was from Martin Luther King, and it was part of a speech that he made 47 years ago, a few weeks before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. It was almost literally, well, it was, I think, the last speech that Martin Luther King made before his death. I talked about white privilege last week, and I think as I reflect on what I wrote, and there was much that I left out of what I presented to you in the original draft of that sermon, I realized that I only touched the very, very tip of the iceberg, and that probably what I said represents about 1/10 of 1% of the totality of the issue. It's a big one. But I talked in that sermon, and I want to build upon that this week when I talk about Black Lives Matter. I talked in that sermon about having an awareness and not guilt. Awareness and not guilt about white privilege. I talked about the fact that there are different kinds of privilege, and that some of us have more than others, and that some of us, particularly in this room, including myself and Jeff and George and others with a lot of higher education, all of us white, have much more privilege than many other people. And you can talk about women, you can talk about gays, you can talk about trans and transgender people, all right? I talked about a tougher concept, but it is extremely important, and it relates to the sermon today, though I won't mention it very much. Intersectionality, and the way in which different aspects of our life are woven together. It's like a tapestry. It is complex and has different veins and different threads to it. But in the end, all of these things are related. So as we talk about racism in our society, we need to, at this one and the same time, talk about violence, about the economic issues, and you can go right down down the list: education, healthcare, the whole gamut of issues that we all know about. So these intersect. They always intersect. And finally, I talked about moral imagination, of not only putting yourself in the shoes or within the body, using that as a metaphor, of another person to see how they view a particular situation, but also imagining how God must see this whole issue, of getting yourself inside the cries of the great prophets, particularly Isaiah, who cries out, "Thus saith the Lord." It's the "Thus saith the Lord" part that's always the most important. What do we need to do to correct the problems of injustice in our world? So that's kind of a quick summary of last week. Right off the top here, right off the top of this sermon, I want to acknowledge openly and quietly, and I hope understandingly, even empathetically, that many people, including indeed many black people, find the terms white privilege and Black Lives Matter to be offensive and troubling. So I want to acknowledge that right at the top. At the very least, I think both of those terms, particularly the latter, run against the grain of our idealism if we are people who are sincerely trying to be just and honorable in our society, these phrases somehow grate on us. I understand that. So the retort to the second term, Black Lives Matter, I discovered, is most often all lives matter. And it's an angry retort that is given by people. We've seen a lot of our politicians, particularly Rudy Giuliani, say that in a very, very angry voice. But it is a response that many people make. All lives matter. They are offended by Black Lives Matter. That was the response of my grandson, Ryan, who is a senior now in high school, and he's become a very sensitive and caring teenager, I think, with rather deep concerns for his age, I think, for the issues of racism and the related variables that surround that. And I respect Ryan's opinion immensely. So I want everybody to know, because I suspect some of you have some misgivings about these terms, I want everyone to know that I understand that response, even though I believe it is seriously misguided and false within the complex matrix of racism in the United States. If people were to say, I wish all lives did matter, but they don't yet, I would consider that to be much closer to the mark. Otherwise, to say as an angry response, all lives matter, ends up being a terrible illusion. For the overwhelming factual evidence, I know, don't confuse anybody with the facts, but yeah. Because the overwhelming factual evidence is that in myriad places, all lives do not matter, and not simply Black lives. But we're talking about Black lives here. But my point is that many are left out. And if we don't realize that, we live on a different planet. So I plead here for openness and understanding. The Black Lives Movement technically began in Ferguson, Missouri, after a police officer, Darren Wilson, shot a 17-year-old boy, Michael Brown. His dead body lay in the street in the sun, the hot sun, it was very, very hot that day, for 4 long hours without an ambulance being called, about any attempt to resuscitate him. None of that happened. He was just there. He was dead. And his body was left to begin the decaying process. It's extremely obscene, I think. And hundreds of people gathered around as the anger mounted. Subsequently, as you know, the official decision was made to not even indict Darren Wilson, a decision that many believed essentially amounted to a legal lynching. And we also remember, I hope, that Ferguson erupted with riots. The fire department then allowed the commercial district of Ferguson, of nearly in the all-black section of the city, to burn. They didn't even answer the call. President Obama even went on TV pleading for patience and respect for law and order. Imagine a so-called black president of the United States using a dog whistle, if you will. And many, many people who watched this on TV were extremely offended. And if you watched the screen that day, many of the channels juxtaposed Obama with the scene of the angry crowd in Ferguson, and it was as though the words of Obama were falling on deaf and angry ears. This eruption was not a repeat of the previous August, when there were other demonstrations against police brutality, and fires also burned in many places, including our own Baltimore. No, this time, as one writer put it, these were flames of resignation and exhaustion. And subsequently, as I hope you remember, the wholesale corruption of the Ferguson Police Department was exposed. The blatant and the wholesale oppression and exploitation of the black community was exposed. Heads rolled, there were investigations, even at the federal level, that took place, showing the irrefutable evidence of unmitigated racism. But Ferguson was not an isolated incident. Just before the Wilson decision was announced, Tamir Rice was killed in Cleveland, a little kid of 12 playing with a toy gun in a park. 9 days before that death, Tanisha Anderson was slammed to the cement in a judo hole by an officer and killed, also in Cleveland. Days later, on Staten Island, a jury refused to indict the officer who killed Eric Garner in a chokehold. And the list goes on and on and on. And there are lots of names that we don't know about. The deeper reality, this difficult saga in US history, is that it really did not begin in Ferguson any more than the civil rights movement began in Montgomery, Alabama. It would be disingenuous of us to even think an isolated incident like Ferguson can stand all by itself, albeit with no relationship to past events, let alone the intersecting issues in our society. Here's the intersectionality, all right, in our society that impact a city like Ferguson or Washington, D.C., or Baltimore, or New York, day after day after day, year after year, decade after decade. We can never dismiss the important variables like poverty and poor education and decaying infrastructures, especially in poor black neighborhoods, high unemployment. The list goes on and on. George alluded to our Wednesday morning group that we have enjoyed for how many years now. We are now looking at the theology. We're doing good theology with John Dominic Crossan. Crossan insists that one cannot do any serious study of an issue, let alone biblical we cannot do any serious study of an issue or biblical issues without doing theology, and we cannot do it unless we understand what he calls the matrix. The matrix, key word, remember that. My Old Testament professor in seminary used to say to the class, context, context, context. You always have to look at the biblical passage that you're studying within its context in order to just begin to understand it. Yes, that's important, but Crossan would say that doesn't go far enough. So we need to go far, really, all of the way back, in our case, to England and a philosopher named John Locke, from whom our friend Thomas borrowed the phrase in the Declaration of Independence that we know of as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Except John Locke used the term property instead of happiness.
Yes.
Think about that for a minute, all right? Locke had it right, I think, since the whole idea of this nation-building enterprise was about property. And guess for whom? Property for white men, wealthy, landed gentry, who were right from the beginning dependent upon others' labor for their sustenance and well-being. Now that's probably a bit simplistic to put it that way, but I think the nub of the issue, we hit it here. That was the basic idea behind slavery in the first place. And the fact that in the original Constitution, slaves counted for 3/5 of a person. But, worse than that, slaves were not counted as persons or as people. They were counted as pieces of property. And that's part of the matrix. So to deal with matrix means that we begin to see the legacy. And as horrific as it was, the whole institution of slavery, and then of Jim Crow, and of segregation, of the Civil War, it means that we begin to re-examine the stories of people like Harriet Tubman and Mary Lou Hamer and John Brown, as well as our recent heroes, John Lewis and Martin Luther King. It means that we try to get inside of a people in order to feel in our very bones the cries of anguish, the bitterness, the long and seemingly endless struggle for freedom. It means that we try to understand what it must feel like to live in a society where driving while black becomes a sin, where people quite literally in 2016, my friends, have laws enacted in various states to disenfranchise minority voters. A system that sends more black men disproportionately to prison, most of whom have committed non-violent crimes. The point, of course, is that the matrix is wide and broad and long and winding, with by far more debilitating moments than joyous ones. But for those of us, I trust, in the faith community, there is also another matrix that is important. And the troubling question for all of us, so-called Christians, is whether we will treat that matrix seriously or not. The question is, will we probe the deeper depths to seek out deeper truths, or will we simply give lip service to all of the nice, sweet things in our pious prayers and our rituals? The Exodus passage read this morning, indeed the whole Exodus story, is about liberation from oppression in Egypt that Pharaoh exacted upon the Jews. Let my people go. Can we take an ancient story more than 3,000 years old and see why black people have made that story into several spirituals? When King cried out from the Lincoln Memorial that he had been to the mountaintop and looked over into the promised land, he'd seen it. He'd seen it in his vision, in his dream. But I may not get there. I may die first. But I fear nothing, not even death. Can we then resonate with the people whose fathers and sons and husbands have been lynched, or those who have experienced the whip and the dogs of Bull O'Connor? The call for liberation has always been part of the main theme of every single solitary black movement in our history. Another part of that theme, intersecting at every level, is that of justice in a world where privileged people, like all of us, very often want privilege for ourselves, but we desire much less privilege for those who desperately need more of it. So an ancient sheep herder chastises the establishment of his day, who claim to want justice for all, but who really don't. who offer their burnt offerings to a just God and then turn right around and act unjustly. The prophet Amos. And the sad irony is that the institutional Christian church in the U.S. has been the bastion through the years as a supporter of oppression. Sunday morning worship time in America is still, my friends, the most segregated time of the entire week. Now, to be sure, and I'm quick to add this, it has also been the institutional church that has fought the hardest for racial justice. I said to my good friend Jack Cooper, who lived in Montclair, we've been friends for how many years now, he's a history buff, and I said, what do you think about the history of Christianity and the good? And he said, well, I think it's about a 50-50 proposition, you know, 50% bad, 50% good. Well, I don't know if I would go as high as 50% good, but at least we need to be fair. And finally, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. I love this. I love this parable, but Luke screwed it up. He sells out the empire because what's going on here is, again, the matrix is Roman rule and poverty. And so people are robbing one another because they have to survive. But all of that issue is ignored by Luke. And we boiled this parable down to a simplistic notion of what it means to be a good neighbor. Well, it's being a good neighbor, to be sure, but that's really not the essence of it. Luke was somehow working with the drunken elves, I think, when he put all of this together. But it is, nonetheless, a powerful, powerful parable. Jesus turns the tables on his Jewish listeners by telling them something that is so literally absurd that they can't possibly believe it. Jews and Samaritans traditionally hated one another, and indeed many Jews looked upon Samaritans as an inferior half-breed race. A severe kind of ethnic profiling, if you will, prevailed in a culture that was insecure already at the best. So you can imagine the laughter that must have broken out when Jesus tells some of his Jewish followers this parable, because there is no conceivable way in their minds that a Samaritan would ever help a Jew. A Jew in the ditch, beaten by robbers and left to die? Probably another Samaritan committed that robbery and that beating. There is no conceivable way a Jew would ever accept help from a Samaritan. This is really a story fundamentally about distributive justice, where human need trumps all, regardless. Where one literally risks the possibility of being robbed. That's the position the Samaritan puts himself in, of being robbed also or beaten to death, in order to be an ally of one who is suffering. It is a parable that lifts high the inherent worth and dignity of all people, no matter what. It's a parable that is packed. Shame on you, Luke, for destroying it. The Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson is now beyond a moment. It is a movement. And the establishment, including President Obama, has tried to contain it. I think the establishment simply does not get it. But it is far from being contained now. I don't think it can be. It has been largely led by women, which makes it very, very different from the civil rights movement. It has been carefully nonviolent, while at the same time being confrontational. And although its major focus has been on policing, it has become intersectional in its demands, dealing with poverty and education and housing and prisons and the gamut of judicial issues, and finally the economy itself. Now we're getting to a place where it's going to hurt a lot, because part of what is now happening within the movement is a challenge to capitalism itself as a system which almost inherently leads to violence and injustice. This is hard territory, folks, particularly when checks and balances are literally torn away through legislation that favors the rich and the wealthy. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, I don't know where the Taylor came from. I like the other. She is a professor at Princeton. Has written what I think is a seminal book. It's the best read that I have found so far on the subject. In a book entitled From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And I end with a long quote from her, because I think it really says it all. The aspiration for black liberation cannot be separated from what happens in the United States as a whole. Black life cannot be transformed while the rest of the country burns. It's very interesting that King talked about this with Harry Belafonte a few short weeks before he was assassinated, about living in a new order that was burning down. Somehow King seemed to be able to see the future in a lot of ways. But she continues, the fires consuming the United States are stoked by widespread alienation of low-wage and meaningless work, unaffordable rents, suffocating debt, and poverty. The essence of economic inequality is borne out in a simple fact. There are 400 billionaires in the United States and 45 million people living in poverty. 400 billionaires and 45 million living in poverty. Profit comes at the expense of a living wage. Corporate executives, university presidents, and capitalists in general are living the good life because so many others are living a life of hardship. And the struggle for black liberation, then, is not an abstract idea molded in isolation from the wider phenomenon of economic exploitation and inequality that pervades all of American society. It is intimately bound up with them. The struggle for black liberation requires going beyond the standard narrative that black people have come a long way, but have a long way to go, which of course says nothing about where it is that we have, where we are actually trying to get to. It requires understanding the origins and the nature of black oppression and racism more generally. And that's part of what I've been trying to do here, is to try to understand that more thoroughly. Most importantly, it requires a strategy, some sense of how we get from the current situation to the future. Perhaps at its most basic level, black liberation implies a world where black people can live in peace without the constant threat of social, economic, and political woes of a society that places almost no value at all on the majority of black lives. It would mean living in a world where black lives matter. And while it is true that when black people get free, everyone gets free, black people in America cannot get free alone. In that sense, black liberation is bound up with the project of human liberation our human liberation and with social transformation. Amen, my friends.
Amen.